happy Sabbath. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to continue on from what we've been doing last time, but I know it's a long time since last time, so what I want to do is to pick up, just to recap quickly what I've done up to now. And I originally started doing this study to look at empathy, because I think that our test is equality and empathy is key to equality. And we learned from the camp meeting that Elder Perminda had that it really is about teaching us empathy and having that compassion, that love for people that we've somehow neglected in the movement as conservatives, and as thinking that we're doing God's service, we've actually imbibed false doctrine from Protestantism and from the world, the wrong ideas basically from false apostate Protestantism, false religion. And so what we did was we went back and we looked at ancient Israel, and Elder Tess brought out that ancient Israel were affected by Egypt, which we know the Apis Bull study, when she did it back in May last year, was basically opening up the fact that they were influenced heavily, the Israelites, by the Egyptians and their false religion. And then she showed the Apis Bull and the characteristics of Apis Bull. And I think to us it was kind of alien. We thought, how could they make a golden calf? But when she opened up what that golden calf symbolized for Egypt, it was their main god. It was the god who did the fertility, who did the rain, who did the sun, who was the most powerful god, who answered their prayers, who had control of the situation. And we saw that the characteristics of Apis Bull are very similar to God, the creator God. And so when they go out in the wilderness and they are relating to God, their only physical, visible picture for them is an Apis Bull. So they make the golden calf. And we think that's so kind of like, how could they be idolatrous like that? How could they do that? But all they're doing is being influenced by the society they're in and the religion of that society. And I wanted us to try and trace that down through Scripture, how we've been impacted in the same way by Protestantism, and how your picture of God directly affects how you'll worship him, how you will interact with your fellow human beings, and how you interact with the world around you. And I think that's what we've got to see traced down through Scripture. What was God's intention for his people in the world? How were they to interact with the world? What does that look like? And then it impacts our view of church and state, because we are the church. We're God's kingdom in the world. And how does God's kingdom function in this world, this sinful environment? And that's how it's connected. So how they saw God was as this Apis Bull figure, this king, this warrior, this hard, harsh, fighter figure who's going to dominate by force and violence, and who's going to take over the world in that using that method. And we see Israel falling into this trap through its history. So first of all, Moses has that viewpoint. He's going to go out and kill an Egyptian because he's going to take over by force and violence, because he's an Apis Bull leader. And then he has to unlearn that, and he has to deliver Israel in God's method and God's way, and set up God's kingdom in God's way. So every time God raises up his people and gives them a message, he's trying to show them more about who he is, how he functions, what his character is, and how he wants them to operate in the world, how he wants them to promulgate his kingdom, how he wants them to spread the knowledge of who he is. And that is directly impacted by their view of him, how he wants them to do the work, and how they then interact with the place they live, which is church and state on another level. So I want us to have that in the background. I want to move into a study of church and state after this. But today we're going to look at more about empathy through the Bible, because I think when we first came into this truth about equality, that there isn't a Sunday law, because we misunderstood what the test was. We thought this message of equality was quite alien, to get rid of the headship model, for women to rise up to a level with men. That whole message to us was like so alien that we can't see where it comes from almost. It's like it just hit us sideways, and because we'd always seen it as a religious controversy, church and state problem, Sabbath and Sunday. And now we're seeing there's more to this than meets the eye. But I think if we go back now and look at these stories in the light of this test, we'll see that God is always trying to teach his people about himself and how to treat each other, and that they've always got it wrong. And so let's go. And then as a result of that, we looked last time at the concept that Israel had of God, which came not just from Apis Bull, which came from Baal and Molech as well. And so I traditionally made Baal a sun god, And that was our picture of Baal. Well, that was my picture of Baal. And when I went to look into this, I recognised that Baal actually doesn't mean sun god. It means lord, husband, owner, the dominating force. It was the leading god of the Phoenicians, I think it was. And then Molech was the leading god of the, I may not misquote it, was the leading god of another heathen group. I haven't got it right here in front of me. But Molech had similar characters. Molech meant king. In Melech is the Hebrew word for king, and Molech was the leading god in another. I think it was the Amorites, but it was one of the ites. But we went over that last time, and we saw how Molech's characteristics were very similar to Apis bull, because it had a bull head with a human body, and so this god is very similar to Apis bull, and so is Baal. They're both god of fertility, the rain, the sun. We were touching on this yesterday, talking about Baal in our Friday night study, and how Baal is not just the god of the sun, he's the god of the rain and fertility, and this is the story of Elijah. But we've kind of made it a Sabbath Sunday controversy and said, worship Baal, the sun god, or the god of the Sabbath, the creator god. And that picture is kind of stuck with us to limit the test to the Sunday law question. But when we look at a wider picture, these gods were substitute creator gods. These gods were in charge of the elements. They were the dominant god. They were the equivalent to the heathen of the creator God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, masterful king who had these characteristics. And so they mixed that, the Israelites, constantly with the true God. And so we can see from in outward form, the Israelites looked as well. We traced this last time. We looked at how the pagan practices were very similar to the Israelites. So the Israelites looked like the pagans in many ways. They had altars, they had pillars. The pagans set up pillar poles to worship, and the Israelites were told to set up pillars as memorials. And they had altars where they sacrificed. The heathen did the same, but they ended up sacrificing their children. Obviously, the Israelites sacrificed animals. So slightly different there, but the similar concept. They used the same names. We saw how even Israelites had names with Baal in it, because it just meant Lord. So there's this crossover in the culture between the false gods and the false worship and the true worship, and it looks very similar. And as time passed, God has to make a clear distinction between them. So in every history, God is trying to separate them from their wrong concepts about God, separate them from their wrong views of religion that they've imbibed from around them, and he seeks to change their form and their spirit because they've adopted wrong practices and mingled false worship with the true. And it's no different today, except we just don't think it's as dangerous because Protestantism professes to be Bible-keeping Christians. So we see this track of false religion going alongside the true, and how God has to constantly pull out his people separate them from these wrong ideas and wrong practices. So they have this concept of God as a supreme warrior king, male-dominated headship model, aggressive and cruel. And they obviously project that onto God. So we question the portrayal of God when they come out of Egypt. He's a mighty pillar of fire and cloud. And Mount Sinai was on fire, there was shaking, there was loud noise, there was dramatic power. And this buys into their expectation of this powerful, untouchable God who's like supernatural. But when you understand where they're coming from, God has to reach them with that picture in order to bring them into a relationship with him. So he always reaches them where they are and then tries to bring them out somewhere different. So that's why sometimes these things happen in the Old Testament. We think this is so alien to what we know about God in the New Testament. But when we understand their culture, we understand a bit more about what he's trying to deal with. So we can read dispensationally, basically. So we see dispensational reading is essential, and we see progression, how God is constantly trying to progress his people to a better place where they can have a closer walk with him and where they can really do the work effectively. But we see all through the history of the Old Testament and the New to an extent, not so much the New because we say that's history of success, but all through the Old Testament it's history of failure after failure, where he tries to get his people to set up his kingdom in the right way and be his witnesses, but they constantly fail because they don't understand what he's trying to do. And we're in the same boat to a degree. So in the Old Testament we see fire coming down from heaven to burn up the enemies. We see the ground opening up and swallowing up people, and people are stoned. But when you understand the culture of that time, they offered the gods with fire. They burnt people with fire in the pagan religion. They stoned people as a civil punishment. But at the time you get to the time of Christ, they're phasing that out. So to them that was just like in our day going to prison, because that was the corporal punishment for the time. So it's in the context of the times that they're living in that these things are done. And so God works with the societies in, and he leads them to the place where he wants them to be, to get away from that picture. And then in the New Testament, we get this different picture, it seems, of Christ, who rebukes the disciples for wanting to call fire down from heaven, rebukes the people bringing the woman caught in adultery and wanting to stone her. And so it seems like a contrary picture, but it's God trying to progress us on to see that this is the kingdom I want to set up. It was never meant to be a violent, harsh, punishment-based kingdom, but he has to work with almost like children, bringing them on from immaturity to maturity. So we have to see that picture of God through history. So in every generation, God is trying to get to the place where we see him as a compassionate, loving father that is concerned with the plight of the individual. And this is in distinct contrast to the Apis bull figure, or the Baal or the Molech, who's a harsh, cruel, dominating king who controls using force and punishment to control the masses, to control the people at large. But Christ was all about the individual and leading them through love and empathy. And I think if we trace that through Scripture, we'll see God's always been trying to do that. And that's what I want us to look at today. So every time God has raised up a reformer, they've had to learn that they've had a wrong view of God and the prophecies. And then he's given them a specific message for their time. And they've misunderstood something about that message, and they've tried to do it in their own way, and it's gone wrong. And so he's had to pick up the damage and remedy it once they've learned the hard way, it seems. So their view of God is shaped also by society and the false religions around them, and they've had to unlearn and learn again. So we're going to look at several histories. We're going to look at Moses, the disciples, and Paul, and also even the Millerites and slavery question. They had to learn this too. But we're going to focus on, first of all, Adam, then Moses and Christ, and see how God was trying to teach these reformers through history as well as the people at that time. And we'll see how this message of empathy is not so alien, that what he was trying to do with them. So the question is, what does the kingdom of heaven look like? And it's important to understand this in the way we see God and this relationship in the light of church and state. So what does the kingdom of God look like, and how does it interact with the state? How does religion or God's kingdom or the church interact with the world, the people around them, or the state? So let's go back to Adam and see how it started. So if we go back to Adam, we have Adam and Eve, and they had dominion over the whole earth. So they're created to have this position of authority in the earth. They were basically its king and queen, and we've looked at this before, so we won't look at too many texts. We're not going to look at but Adam and Eve were called Adam. They were both given dominion. They were both given this job of tending to the garden. They were to be companions side by side, working on a level equality. She's made from a rib taken by his side. So there's this equality between male and female, and the fact that humans have dominion over the earth, and they were to be the leaders. They were to be, I guess you could say, they were the government and the church at this time. There's a church-state set up that they're fully in harmony with God. They were gardeners, like the sower, so they were to look after nature and tend to the plants and animals. They were to have communion with them. They were to patiently work with them, nurture them to grow. And we've talked about this before, that anyone who's done agriculture or worked with animals knows that it's a painstaking work. Agriculture takes time and patience to see things grow, to bring them from a place of, from a seed to maturity, producing fruit is a process, and it takes patience. So they were to patiently work with and nurture the natural kingdom, basically. There was not to be any aggression or force or arbitrary control. Everything ministered to the needs of everything else. And so you could say that that was an environment of compassion. Everything cared about everything else naturally. It was a natural flow of Adam and Eve caring for the animals having relationship with them. There was to be no violence. There was to be nothing that was to damage this world in a negative way, impact it negatively. So the first thing we see happening negatively is obviously sin comes in, and the first action of human beings is obviously Cain kills Abel. And this is direct opposition to the Spirit of God, because the character of God was to produce life. He gives Adam and Eve life, then he makes all these living creatures, then he makes them look after the life on the planet, to nurture that life. So the whole purpose was to nurture life and relationships. And now we see the opposite of that. We see this destructive element come in, where it's taking away life instead of nurturing. And in Education 23.2, and I've asked Brother Ray, and we do have notes for this that we had last time, but I didn't really want people to sit and just read through the notes. So afterwards, I'll post them in the chat again anyway, so you've got all the information that you need there, so you don't really have to take notes. But I asked Brother Ryan to post it in the chat when we get to a quote to talk about. So thank you for that. So we're doing Education 23.2. So it says here in Education 23.2, it was the will of God that Adam and Eve should not know evil. The knowledge of good had been freely given them, but the knowledge of evil, of sin and its results, of wearing toil, of anxious care, of disappointment, of grief, of pain and death, this was in love withheld. So we can safely say that the original plan was that nobody would know any evil. So even though Lucifer has sinned in heaven, he has rebelled against the whole government of heaven, the whole principles of heaven, and he's fallen. It wasn't God's will that Adam and Eve should know about that evil. Now, how they were warned by the angels in the garden, this is another question. What they were warned about, don't have anything to do with the fallen foe, because they're already, even knowing about Lucifer, you could say they've got some kind of knowledge of evil. But it wasn't God's will that they... So I don't think that means that they didn't know about it intellectually. So we have to do some kind of, ask some questions here, because they had a knowledge of Lucifer. They had a knowledge that he'd rebelled in heaven. So they've got a knowledge, an intellectual knowledge of evil. But so I think on this level, it means that they were not to experience it. So he did not want them to experience it. So you can hear something and it doesn't have to damage you in the way that an experience does. So God is always trying to keep us from having to experience that negativity and that evil. And if we do have to experience it, we learn something from it. But that's another story. So focusing on this knowledge of evil, I'm saying it must be an experience of it. And then when you see what the description is, this knowledge of good had been freely given them. So the knowledge that had been freely given them was this experience in the garden of these beautiful flowers, these animals, the angels visiting them. Everything was good. And we see that in the first week of creation, he says everything was good, everything was good, everything was very good. So all they had experienced was good. But this knowledge of evil, he didn't want them to experience. And so he didn't want them to know what sin was, to experience sin, to experience being cut off from God, its results. And the results were wearing toil. So work now becomes drudgery and destructive, and it wears away the human system. Of anxious care. So we have physical damage, we have mental damage now, which is anxious care. So they were not meant to know what worry, fret, guilt, all those negative emotions, they were not meant to experience them. Of disappointment and grief. So again, this is mental and emotional pain they were not meant to experience. And pain and death. And of course that's physical, mental and spiritual, because not only are you going to experience death, mentally you're going to get disappointment and grief, but pain you're going to get physically and spiritually and mentally, and then death is a cut-off from God. So it's a spiritual death, it's a physical death, and it's an emotional death. So they were never meant to be cut off from God in those three areas. They were never meant to experience dying as a process, so their body getting weaker. Any feelings of pain and negativity they were not meant to experience. So this was God's original plan. So the minute they eat that tree, now they're going to bring all that into the world. And they've now tasted good and evil instead of just evil. And it's interesting that it's not called the tree of knowledge of evil. It's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about why that is. Why didn't God just say, this is the knowledge of evil? Why did he say the knowledge of good and evil? Question, so people can start giving it.
What verse is that?
Any thoughts? That is, I haven't got the verse. Have you got the verse? Genesis, because I'm just reading it from the education quote here. The knowledge of evil. But I know it says the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Oh, it's 2:9. Genesis 2:9.
So Genesis 2:9. It basically says, and out of the ground made the Lord God grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So does anybody have any thoughts about why we would call it the tree of knowledge of good and evil? When they already had all this good in the garden up to now, and now he's put this tree there, and they're not to touch it. CG, did you want to speak? Yeah.
Is it because of the choice that you can make? I mean, God put something in place that you can either choose good or you can choose evil.
Okay, so up to that point, before they ate that tree, were they choosing good or evil?
I think they were just doing it. No, they were choosing good.
Mm-hmm.
Just doing it unconsciously.
Right, so they're unconsciously choosing good. So do they need a tree which says good and evil on it when they're already choosing good? Why didn't it just say the knowledge of evil?
A reminder that there is evil, but choose the good.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying it's almost like it confronts them with this choice, but at the same time they could say there's good in this tree because it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I can discern which one's good and what's good and what's evil. Let me just take whatever fruit I want from this. You could use some justification that they could take from this tree some good. So why isn't it just called the tree of evil? Then she'd say there's nothing good about this tree. Why am I even going to go there? So Brother Leon, Alice, I want to come back on that, CG.
Could we say that it was a test in the beginning, wasn't it? God was testing them, wasn't he?
Okay, so we can say it's a test at the beginning. Yeah, he's testing them, definitely.
And obviously because she wandered off, didn't she?
So
and it's just strange how he happened to be at the tree, wasn't it?
Right, so she's wandered off, she's at the tree, but the question is, why did he call it the knowledge of good and evil when it's just evil, isn't it? Because he doesn't want them to eat of that tree at all. But what? So Brother Leon had some thoughts.
Is it really evil? Because it says both trees are good to the sight and pleasant for food.
Okay, so is it really evil? Because both trees are good for and pleasant for food.
Pleasant to the sight and
pleasant
good
to the
for food.
sight and good for food.
But I was thinking, each tree brings an experience. So the tree of life, that brings about an experience when you eat it. Well, when you eat from the tree, the experience is you continue with life. You continue knowing is experiencing. Because when you trace that word know throughout Genesis, it's knowing. It's like you're experiencing something. Like when Adam knew his wife and Cain knew his wife and whatever.
So knowing is more than intellectual knowledge, it's experience. It's experiencing it practically, physically, emotionally, mentally, going through something. Yeah,
so you're having an experience of when you eat in this tree, you're having an experience. You're experiencing good, basically. But the knowledge of good and evil is kind of a contrast experience what you're going to have when you eat off this tree. So you know good. Well, it's as if you'll know good and evil. But you don't. That's an experience that you don't want to have.
Right.
Because when you eat it, you're going to have that experience of knowing evil.
Yeah.
So you know good and evil at the same time.
Right. So you're saying that when you do eat that tree, you're now going to have an experience of good and evil. And you're going to have this contrasting, you can compare and contrast. Right there, you've got compare and contrast. And this question just came to me now as I'm going through this paragraph, so I've not got any answers. I'm just kind of exploring with you the thoughts, any right or wrong answers.
Cause and effect, think about that.
So you've got cause and effect right there.
Choose one.
And also the mercy of God is that when they ate that tree, was it just evil that they got an understanding of? Because every time we learn more about the bad, we seem to learn more about the good in God's mercy. That it's never just evil in the sense that he can bring good out of bad all the time, and he does it all the time. So although he's not promoting them to eat that tree by saying good and evil, the practicalities of it are the fact that evil does not exist without good.
I think the more you learn about evil, the more you learn about God's mercy.
Right, so the more you learn about evil, the more you learn about God's mercy. So there's this compare and contrast continually. In his mercy, it seems to me that he's protected them. Even with the test, he's saying it's not completely evil. You're not going to die right there, which you would have done, but he knew the plan of salvation was going to be in place. There's all that going on. But the other thing I was thinking is that evil never exists without good, does it?
It's kind of like, I could be wrong.
What about if they passed the test? What would happen then?
Right, so if they'd passed the test, does anybody know what would have happened then if they had passed the test? Do you know, Debbie?
I was just listening to what you were saying about if obviously the
How do we explain what if they passed it?
The fact that they failed the test,
Yeah.
and then through the good and the evil, they were to learn God's mercy. Okay, through the evil, they were to learn God's mercy. What I'm saying is, if they passed the test,
How would they have
how
learned?
would we seen them or looked at them?
How would they have learnt God's mercy? Is that kind of like what you're asking? How would they have learnt about his if they have?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm thinking God always brings good out of evil as a fallback position, because of his character, because of his mercy, but it's not his first intention. So we read the paragraph and it said it wasn't ever his intention that they go through those things, but because they have, he's going to now bring good out of evil. So that his mercy will be displayed, his justice will be understood, more of his character will be understood through that painful process of suffering that the Godhead had to go through now that's happened, as well as us. So, but it wasn't his primary purpose. So your question is a valid one. How would they have learnt more about the character of God when we seem to be learning more than any other world because we've sinned? We're learning more about the mercy, the grace, the love, and everyone else is as they look at how he's dealing with us from the great controversy. So it's almost like it was pre-programmed, pre-planned that we have to go through the cross to understand the love of God. So that's a deep question. But I think in answering if they passed the test, the way I understand it is that if they had a period of probation, and if they had resisted the tree, they would never have had to experience it. I think he would have removed the tree. In that set, I think she says that they would have taken the tree away, because other worlds have this tree. They haven't eaten it. They've not done what we've done. They've still got it there, so they can choose, but they don't want to choose. So they don't, because they see what's happening here. So I think there would have been a time of probation. Then the tree would have been removed, and they'd have passed that test, and they'd have just gone on from strength to strength in their walk with God, which is how he's going to restore us. That now, when we get to heaven now, we're just going to go on that plan again. So we'll go through eternity getting to know him better with greater and greater happiness without experiencing the pain and the sorrow.
And the equality as well, it's right there.
And the equality is right there already.
What we're learning now.
Yeah, that we're going to keep learning through.
But imagine they had it there and it would have expanded.
So they had it there already, and it would have expanded as each family came in.
Yeah.
Every human interaction would have been on equality, would have been treating nicely, would have been learning more about how good God is instead of how bad Satan is. So all that, I don't know how we would have learnt the depths of his mercy and love, but God is able to do that without evil coming in. And we don't know really what that would have looked like, but we'd have just gone from strength to strength. And so we would have got to see through our interactions with nature, through our interactions with each other, the tenderness and the mercy of God. We'd have never lost that picture of him. I don't know how he'd have dealt with Satan. I don't know how all that would have come about, because would we have passed the test and then he said, okay, how would it have proved that he is good and Satan is bad? I'm not sure. Because then we would have said, what are we going to do with Satan now and the angels? Are we just going to burn them in a lake of fire? And that would have been so contrary to Adam and Eve on this beautiful, good earth. They've never seen death, they've never seen fire, they've never seen anything negative. And then we're going to say, we're going to burn up this angel here with all these followers. I don't know how that would have happened. That's that's a deep question. But I'm thinking, going back to the good and evil, that it's that evil never exists without good, and that there's always this, because God created Lucifer, and evil came from Lucifer, so without the goodness of God, there wouldn't have been a Lucifer, there wouldn't have been evil, there's always that, and maybe it's also trying to show us that evil never exists by itself, so error never exists by itself. It always has to be attached to truth. There's always, truth and error is the most powerful mix compared to just straight out error, straight out evil. So maybe it's a parable. It's telling us that this evil, that because we want to do black and white. We want to do that, and we want to say these people are evil or this thing is evil, and there's no goodness in it. That's as well what we want to do. And yet there's always two sides to a story when it comes to dealing with people or dealing with. I don't know if we could say that with truth, but truth is all relative to people as well anyway, and how we hold the truth, what our motives are, all that. So is it always completely evil? It results in evil actions people do, but there's this good and evil when it comes to people and their motives, and so much is that we can't see about people and how they operate, the way we see things, that we can't be that black and white perhaps when we're dealing with people. I don't know. I think I'm still not sure exactly why it said good and evil, but it seems to me that there's this relationship between good and evil, and it's not that straightforward to say that everything's, maybe it is straightforward to discern good and evil, but it just seems to me in this world that evil is always associated with good or truth, or if we look at truth and error, that error never stands by itself. And this is why conspiracy theories are so powerful, because they're a mixture of truth and error, that there's always this thing about evil and good going together, and it being a parasite and living off truth, or evil being a parasite and living off evil being a parasite and living off good. Sophie says in the chat, there was always a choice, and it's your choosing to partake of it brings in the evil. If you don't eat it, it won't bring on evil. It's like when people say money is bad. Money is just an object, but it's how we use it that allows it to be used for good or bad. And I think that's what I was thinking along the lines of, is the thing in itself actually evil? And that's the point Brother Leon made, which was every tree was good to the sight and pleasant to the sight and good for food. And you think, and that's kind of proven when the serpent's eaten that fruit, it doesn't kill him. And Eve eats the fruit and it doesn't kill her. But the test is obedience to God, and so it's this, the thing in itself is perhaps not, it's the motive behind it, it's the reason why we do the action, it's deeper than the thing itself that makes it good or bad, perhaps that's what Sophie's trying to say. So that was a diversion, sorry, I wasn't going to go there, but the point was that we weren't supposed to experience any of this negativity, and there's more to this tree of knowledge of good and evil, which we have to learn as we go along the path. And I think we want to say that as we approach Christianity and the Bible and God, we want to, in the world, we want to see this kind of clear distinction between good and evil, but there's always seems to be a bit of a mixture going on with the test that we face. So like Protestantism, we think Protestantism's good, it's protesting against the papacy, but then we realise it goes apostate, and it's kind of, it's not what we thought it was. And we thought conservative Adventism is good, and then we realise actually the way we handle it's not good. There's this kind of unlearning and learning to do with this whole concept of the great controversy. So let's go on to Moses. Before we do that, let's see how this Cain killing Abel set now precedents for how people who rebel against God are going to behave. So the people that are serving God are kind, generous, gentle, compassionate. Adam and Eve, nurturing the garden, they're gardeners. Their occupation is a gentle, painstaking, patient one. The work they're doing is along those lines. There's no force and aggression and destruction in it. There was no decay in the garden. There was no negativity in that garden until sin came in. Now Cain kills Abel, and that spirit of hatred and killing is in direct opposition to God's kingdom. So we're going to say God's kingdom is life and compassion and kindness, and then over here we have aggression and death and destruction. And that spirit of death and destruction and that desire to kill is satanic, and that's the root of Satan's kingdom, is destruction and deception and lies and error and everything that goes along with it. But the root of that spirit is persecution and destruction and death, to take away the life of another human being. So then we have we see the story of Jacob, where he's deceiving his brother for the birthright. So he has spiritual motives which are good, and he's professing to love God, but ultimately he's killing Esau by the whole way he wants to deceive him, steal his birthright, take his right to that life inheritance from God, that blessing from God. And so that spirit is wrong. He's got the wrong spirit. That spirit of deception is satanic. Then we get to Moses, and he kills an Egyptian, and that spirit is satanic. He wants to wipe out the enemy. He wants to kill, to take over, and that's not how God wants to set up the kingdom. Then we get to the time of Christ, and we see the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they want to kill Jesus, and that whole spirit again is the satanic kingdom spirit. It's the apis bull spirit. It's an aggressive, harsh God who wants to control and punish people and kill those that don't agree with them. And then we see even Paul the apostle, the greatest apostle who wrote most of the New Testament, has got that same apis bull spirit in stamping out heresy. He's killing Christians. And so we can see that thread through history, how they've accepted the principles of Satan's kingdom in the way they handle God's work. And I think that's really important to see when it comes to this subject of empathy. So let's see what Moses had to go through. If we go back to our Alpha history of ancient Israel, this quote is taken from Signs of the Times, August 24th, 1891, paragraph 4. So I'll put it up on the board just for those who are watching. So the first one was education. And this one is Signs of the Times, August 24th. I'll get the page for the education in a minute. August 24th, 1891, paragraph 4. So I'm going to say this is empathy in the Bible. So I think the first one was education. What's that one? Education 23.2. And then when we've done that one with Moses, we'll do first 1 SP 153.1. I just want to pull something from that. Okay, so let's look at Moses and what he had imbibed and what he had to unlearn. So this says, when Moses was feeding his flock in the pastures of Midian, the Lord was preparing him for a position of great responsibility. He was to be a labourer together with God. Educated in the court of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he was imperfectly qualified to take his place as the leader of a suffering, tempted people, to help them in their oppression, sympathise with their sufferings, and conduct them through a rough and dangerous desert to the land of promise. The Lord, in his providence, took Moses from the king's court and gave him the humble work of a shepherd, that while caring for the sheep in the desert, he might be trained for the trials and hardships and perils of the wilderness, and qualified for the office of a shepherd of his own flock, for a church whose God was the Lord. So there's quite a lot in here, and we just want to take it sentence by sentence. So Cedra will be happy for this. Sorry, we've been studying sentence by sentence, and we've been trying to use parable methodology to analyse passages of Spirit of Prophecy. And this is a really useful exercise to do. And if you do it in groups or with individuals, I encourage everyone to do this and take a passage, and you'll get so much more out of it when you break it down and discuss it. So we're just going to take it sentence by sentence. So what was Moses' job in the first sentence? So let me ask Sister Cedri, what was Moses' job in the first sentence? Are you there, Cedri? Can you unmute? No, she's not unmuting. Brother Debray, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's Moses' job in the first sentence?
Feeding his flock.
Feeding his flock. So what would you call that?
A farmer in today's day and age.
A farmer in today's day and age. Okay, we might call it a farmer. We would probably call it a farmer, but you might call it a shepherd as well. Yeah. So he's feeding his flock in the pastures of Midian. So he's in Midian and he's feeding sheep. And then why is he doing that? From the sentence, why is he doing that?
He's preparing him for a position of responsibility.
Who is?
God is.
God is. Good. So God has put him here to prepare him for a position of great responsibility. And
Why?
Yeah. So Brother Leon, you can ask any questions, come in and help. Yeah, so Brother Leon says why?
Because he was imperfectly qualified.
Okay, it doesn't actually say that in a sentence, but you're doing compare and contrast. You're saying he mustn't.
He was to be a labourer with God together.
Right, because he was to be a labourer together with God. So what does that imply about before he was doing this? If he was to be a labourer together with God, and this would prepare him to do that, he was to be, this is future. What does that imply about before?
He wasn't qualified or ready to do it.
He wasn't qualified or ready to do it. And if you just use the words of the paragraph, if we do compare and contrast, we do the opposite of what it says. If this was to prepare him to be a labourer together with God, what wasn't he before?
He was not a labourer with God.
He was not a labourer with God. So he was not working with God before this point, presumably on one level, because it says that he's out here in the wilderness, in the Midian now, feeding the flock. The Lord's preparing him for a position of great responsibility. and he was to be a labourer together with God. So he's going to be a worker alongside God. So we get that picture of, say, a yoke. You're standing beside someone, they're working with you. Presumably he wasn't working with God before. And Brother Leon?
Well, if you compare and contrast,
Yeah.
he was, if you know where he was working with man.
Yeah.
Not the father, but the earthly king.
Okay, he's going to go into the
Yeah,
yeah. He's going to do that. he's going ahead. He's breaking his own rules in a way. But yeah, but you're right. So he was doing something else before. I know we could bring pre-knowledge. We keep trying not to bring pre-knowledge into it. But he was working somewhere else before. Now he's feeding sheep, and the Lord's preparing him for a position of great responsibility, implying perhaps that he didn't have a position of great responsibility before, or that he didn't have it, because this is the preparation he needs to have this position of great responsibility. So that's very interesting, isn't it? So he hasn't had a position of responsibility before. He's not been a labourer with God before, because this work is preparing him to do those two things. Feeding sheep is going to prepare him to do those two things. So let's go to sentence 2, and Brother Leon can come in. So sentence 2 says, educated in the court of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he was imperfectly qualified to take his place as the leader of a suffering, tempted people. So let's stop there. So now what's she doing? What methodology are we using here? You want to answer that?
Mm-hmm.
Or anybody?
Education. So she's kind of comparing what she said because she's making a contrast of what she said in the first sentence, where he was working for the king of Egypt rather than the king of heaven, and working for this earthly king. He was imperfectly qualified. So he wasn't qualified to take the place as a leader of a suffering, tempted people. So so he wasn't qualified to lead, working for the king. Yeah, she's kind of making a contrast.
So yeah, she's making a contrast between the first sentence of the job he was doing now in the first sentence. The job he's doing right now is feeding this flock. Now she goes back in time and she says, educated in the court of Pharaoh. So now we see, so basically we could say from the first sentence, now we use compare and contrast, she's saying educated in the court of Pharaoh. So in the past, he was educated or trained or taught in the court of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So he's in the highest, so the most important country in the world at that time. He's in the highest place in that country. He's in the court of Pharaoh. He's in the king's palace. And he's educated in the king's palace with the best education he could possibly receive. And yet, he was imperfectly qualified to take his place as the leader of a people. Now, we look at that and then we say, okay, let's draw out some principles from that then. So, what's going on here then? How do we explain this? Because in human terms, he's educated in the court of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He was imperfectly qualified. So he's had this education in man's eyes, in a human world, by humans, and with the king of Egypt as its head, and it's imperfectly qualified him to do this work that's about to be done, that needs to be done. So, using compare and contrast, who was he a labourer together with before? If we use compare and contrast. So the first sentence tells us he's feeding flock in the pastures of Midian. The Lord was preparing him to do this great work of responsibility and to be a labourer with God. Who was he a labourer with before, do you think? Anybody, let me see, who can I ask?
Somebody.
Sister Cedri, I don't know if she keeps dropping out. No? Anyone else? Sister Magda?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, who's that?
He was labouring with Pharaoh?
Yes, Sister Moy, he was labouring with Pharaoh. So here he is because he's been educated by God now. In the first sentence, God's educating him and preparing him. In the second sentence, we see he's educated in the court of Pharaoh. And the leader there, the leading example teacher, whatever you say, is Pharaoh. And we know, and if I guess we can bring some knowledge into it, imperfectly qualified him. What was he doing with Pharaoh? if we see the first sentence, so it says it imperfectly qualified him to be a leader of a suffering people. So what was he doing in the court of Pharaoh? So whatever he was doing, it didn't qualify him to lead a group of people.
Well, he was leading a group of people.
Right, so that's what I'm saying, is pre-knowledge. I'm thinking, is that pre-knowledge now we're bringing?
Yeah, it is.
He was leading a group of people. He was educated by Pharaoh, and he was the captain of the army of Pharaoh. So he was leading a group of people. So we're going to bring that in there. So in human terms, he's the highest military leader in the land. He's leading the most important, probably, group of people there is, the army, to win battles for the country. He's under Pharaoh, the most important king head. And yet, all that experience imperfectly qualifies him to lead a group of suffering, tempted people. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it doesn't say he wasn't qualified. It just said he was imperfectly qualified. So could you say he has some qualification, but not enough to lead the group that God wanted him to lead?
Right, so he's got some qualification. That's a good point, I think. So it's imperfectly qualified. So he's got some qualification of some kind, perhaps to lead a group of people in this context, but it's imperfect.
Yeah, so this education that he received, it was the education of the king, and it wasn't the education of God, because God sent him to the pastures of Midian to lead a flock, and that was to be his education. So we have two different educations. One was sheep, which is pointed out specifically, and then the education what Pharaoh gave him. And the one that Pharaoh gave him wasn't enough for this great responsibility where God was leading him.
Right. So there's something, so it wasn't enough, the education he'd received, for this responsibility to lead a group of people, even though he was qualified to be a leader of some kind there in Egypt, in the courts. He's received this best education. It's imperfect qualification. Now, if we look in human terms, man's eyes, I'm sure most people would agree that he's the most qualified man for the job. And in human terms, there's nothing wrong with his education. It looks good. It all looks good on paper. It looks good in experience. But now he has to go out and look after sheep to be qualified to lead this group of people. So there's something about looking after sheep in the pastures of Midian that's going to qualify him to lead this group of people. So she says, placed as a leader of a suffering, tempted people, to help them in their oppression, sympathize with their sufferings, and conduct them through a rough and dangerous desert to the land of promise. So he wasn't, so if we're looking at this comparing contrasting, she's saying he's not qualified properly to do that. So he's not qualified properly to help someone in their oppression, to sympathize with their sufferings, or lead them through a rough and dangerous desert. And this is an army captain we're talking about who's not able to lead a group of people through a rough and dangerous desert. So what is it about him that he's not qualified to do it?
He doesn't have empathy.
He doesn't have empathy. And that, I just want us to see that, and if we can't stress that enough, he doesn't have empathy. That's the only, is that the only thing missing? I was about to say it was, but I'm not sure. Would we agree that's the only thing missing?
Yeah, also, if you just compare these oppressed people, so if you just compare the experience of these oppressed people that he has to lead through the dangerous desert and so on, if you compare that experience that he's not prepared for to the experience what God brings into with leading the flock, if you just compare the flock, how they are, how helpless they are and so on, he has to go through that experience to see empathy, understand what life is like from their perspective, and that's kind of building empathy. So then he can build more empathy with the Israelites who are oppressed and helpless, and they need a leader. It's like the sheep. It helps. God's trying to show him, okay, I want you to learn to build empathy, understand their experience from their perspective, and then I want you to lead them. Learn how to lead the sheep. Yeah. It will help you to learn how to lead the oppressed people, so then you can more sympathize with them because you've seen what they're going through. You're understanding them and so on. So he didn't have that experience as a military leader, because what's the role of a military leader? They're not oppressed. They're the Egyptians are they're the oppressors.
They're the oppressors.
So it's living with them from their perspective, understanding them from their perspective.
So going back to his experience then in Egypt, so we're going to bring pre-knowledge because it says that he was qualified, educated in the court of Pharaoh. We know what his position was. It was a military leader. We know he's led the armies, but he's not part of the oppressed group at this point. Although, so did Moses have an understanding of the job that he was called to do?
No, he did not.
No.
Does everyone agree with that? Daisy, is Daisy there? Did Moses have an understanding of the job that he was about to do? Did he understand what job he was going to do? I don't know if Daisy can unmute. Everyone's quiet.
No, I'm here. I'm just thinking. Sorry, do you know, I'll be honest. I've kind of got a little bit lost. It's no one's fault. It's mine.
Okay, you're not
so
concentrating.
The question is,
Come on.
I'm assuming you're asking before he did the job, does he have an understanding? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm asking in Egypt, when he was educated in Egypt, did he understand the job that he was called to do?
I think he did, but not in the right way.
Okay,
So
my question actually wasn't understand. My question was, did he know what job he was called to do?
I think he knew. Yeah, he knew he was meant to be the deliverer of Israel. How he was going to do it, I don't think he fully comprehended.
Okay, so he had an understanding. Of course, he had an understanding. He had a pretty accurate understanding of the job he was called to do. From birth, he's been called to deliver God's people. His mother's trained him. He's got a knowledge of Scripture. He's got a knowledge of God. He knows all about God to the extent, and we've learnt this previously, so I'm going to bring that in, is that when he went to the palace of Pharaoh, he knew that he was not to give his affections to Pharaoh and to his stepmother, or that was his way of handling it. Actually, he didn't know, but that was his way of handling it because he wanted to keep himself separate from the Egyptians. He wanted to identify with the Israelites. He knew they were his people, and he was all out to deliver them. So I would say he has a pretty good intellectual understanding of what the work is he's about to do. And yet, he's not qualified. And so, as you say, he doesn't have a right understanding of that work. So it leads him now to kill an Egyptian. Go on.
Yeah. So we have two groups of people. We have the Egyptians and the Israelites. So how we managed the Egyptians, the army, and how we led them is not the same way he lead God's people. And I think that he had to understand that. Otherwise, he would have led God's people the same way he would have led the Egyptians, basically. And that's, you say, you can add warfare to that.
Yeah.
You know, fighting and war. However, Moses led as a leader. That same, whatever, he would have brought to God's people.
Yeah.
He probably would have went totally wrong.
Yeah. So he's got a character now that has been shaped by his experience in Egypt, his concept of leadership, his concept of the Apis bull, his view of God and how God's going to use him to deliver his people is shaped by his Egyptian education. And I'm going to say, I don't know who we want to say Egypt is here. We'll do that in a minute. But so let's read the rest of the paragraph. So he's not qualified to help them in their oppression. He doesn't sympathize with their sufferings, even though we see him sympathetic. He's sympathetic enough to kill the opposition, to defend his brother. He kills the opposition. So he takes this into his own hands. He says, you shouldn't be doing that to my brother Israelite. I'm going to kill you in place of it. But his action is wrong. His feelings are wrong towards that. So he's got the right, a right motive in a way that he wants to deliver his brother. He wants to protect his Israelite brother. But doing that, he wants to kill another person and bring death and destruction to the opposition, which isn't the right spirit to do it in. So he's not got sympathy in the right way with the sufferings of the people. Even though you could say on one level he's got sympathy because he kills someone to defend them. So what does it look like to have sympathy? He doesn't help them in their oppression because killing the Egyptian wasn't the right thing to do. And he's not qualified in some way to conduct them or lead them through this rough, dangerous desert. And we could think about what that looks like in a minute, because that's not so obvious to see. Well, why wasn't he? Because as an army leader, he would be qualified, wouldn't he, to lead people through rough and dangerous territory. So what is it about his ability to conduct them that's not good enough? It's imperfect. So let's read the next sentence. The Lord in his providence took Moses from the king's court and gave him the humble work of a shepherd, that while caring for the sheep in the desert, he might be trained for the trials and hardships and perils of the wilderness, and qualified for the office of a shepherd of his own flock, for a church whose God was the Lord. So, providence, it says God himself took him from the king's court and gave him this humble work of a shepherd. So why did he do that? Sister Magda, why did he do that? Why did he take him from the king's court, where he's an army leader, leading people, dealing with people on a daily basis, into Midian, the wilderness, to look after sheep? Just going from the sentence. You there? Are you there, Sister Magda?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he took him and gave him to the humble work of shepherd, so he can learn all that what he didn't have, so he can learn to sympathize and
What does it say in this sentence? Yeah, so he can learn to sympathize and help them in their oppression. What does it say in this sentence? That why he gave him that work. I think there's two reasons probably, maybe more.
so he can get trained for the trials and hardships.
Okay, so it would train him for trials, hardships and perils in the wilderness. Yeah. And what else? So it says that he might be trained for those trials, perils and hardships, and he might be qualified for what?
Office of a shepherd.
Yeah. So now he's a shepherd of his own flock. Now there's two things there really. How would you relate those to the ones you just wanted to say in the previous sentence? It said he was imperfectly qualified, and these were the reasons why he was imperfectly qualified. Can you see repeat and enlarge there, and which one goes with what? So that this previous sentence says he was imperfectly qualified for the following reasons, and this one says that he might be qualified or trained. So compare and contrast, she says in the first one what he wasn't qualified to do, and now she's saying what he might be qualified to do. So can you put them next to each other? So which bit's repeated and enlarged? Which bit matches which bit? Do you understand my question?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'm not sure with the answer.
What's that? So in the previous sentence it told us what he wasn't qualified to do. There were kind of two things he wasn't qualified to do. If we kind of compact it into two things, because we've got two things in this sentence, let's match these two to the previous sentence. So we've got help them in their oppression, sympathize with their sufferings, and conduct them through a rough and dangerous desert to the land of promise. So what two things was he not qualified to do really? Do you want me to ask someone else?
Yes, please.
Okay, don't worry. Don't worry. It's probably on the spot. I don't know whether people get distracted when they're not. Debbie, Sister Debbie, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how would you say this is repeat and enlarge from the previous sentence?
So he was unqualified because of because he didn't have knowledge of their oppression and their suffering.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you've got, but then he might be trained for the trials and hardships. So now, because he's disqualified because of those things, now he's going to get the training to do the trials and hardships and the perils of the wilderness.
So you're going to put what are you saying? That's repeat and enlarge of the trials and hardships, or repeat of the helping oppression and sympathizing with suffering.
Right. Okay. So she tells you what the things are,
Right.
and now God is going to fix that
Yeah.
by training him for the trials and hardships of the perils of the wilderness,
And which bit?
will qualify him for the office.
Which bit does that fix? So because
That the part that the part that where he's disqualified to be the leader because he doesn't have the suffering. He doesn't have the because he's not a leader. Leader of a suffering tempted people. I'm looking at that part.
okay, so if he's got leader of a suffering tempted people. So he's not. But if we look at help them in their oppression and sympathise with their sufferings, if we put that together, we can say he doesn't have empathy, basically. He doesn't identify with these suffering people. And he's not qualified to guide them through this rough and dangerous desert to the land of promise. Why isn't he? So that those two things he hasn't got there. And now she goes on to explain in the next sentence what he has to learn.
Exactly. And that sort of fixes that. God is telling us now.
So which bit fixes which problem? Which bit fixes him able to lead them?
Trained. So while caring for the sheep, okay, so that they're going to start giving him that empathy that he needs by caring for the sheep, okay, and also that he's going to be trained in the trials and hardships. So now we're told how that's going to be fixed. I don't know how you.
Okay, so which bit do you want? So
prepared for the work ahead. In other words.
So there's two things she says he's going to learn. So while caring for the sheep in the desert, he's going to learn two things. What two things is he going to learn while caring for those sheep?
Trials and the hardships.
He's going to learn how to deal with trials and hardships, and he's going to be qualified to be a shepherd of his flocks. He's going to learn how to look after the sheep. He's going to learn how to lead and guide them, but how to look after them, I think. But
that is the humble work of a shepherd.
Yeah, the humble work of a shepherd. So he's going to learn how to deal with hardships and trials in the wilderness, and he's going to learn how to care for those sheep in that setting. So put those two things he's going to learn with the previous sentence. He's going to, with the empathy and the conducting them on this rough and dangerous desert. So there's two things there he doesn't know how to do. He doesn't know how to empathise with the sheep, showing, help and suffering to the suffering, sympathising and helping. And he doesn't know how to lead them through this rough and dangerous desert or conduct them through it. And these two things now in the next sentence are going to help him with those two things. So which bit's going to help him with what?
Okay, the caring for the sheep, the humble work of a shepherd. Obviously, there's a humbleness that needs to come into it as well. It's going to help him to it.
So what were the two things that he's going to learn? Because I'm saying the humble work of a shepherd while caring for the sheep is all one kind of introduction to the two.
I would say the humble work of the shepherd.
Okay.
Humble shepherd, that to me.
He's going to learn that, but that's not that bit of the sentence I was focusing on. So that's the introduction to it. There's the humble work of a shepherd while caring for the sheep.
Caring for the sheep in the desert.
That he might be trained for the trials and perils and hardships and qualified for the office of a shepherd of his own flock. So using that wording, those two things, he's going to be qualified for the office of shepherd and he's going to be trained in trials and hardships and perils. I wanted to map those two on the two qualities before that he didn't have. So which part of the sentence? She's repeating and enlarging the same idea, but and it's all to do with being a shepherd, but the points she's making are how he's going to get qualified to look after those, sympathise and help those sheep. He's going to learn this. I'm putting that next to he's going to be qualified for the office of the shepherd of his own flock. He's going to be taking that personal responsibility for those sheep and getting involved in their sufferings and helping them in their oppression, and that's that qualifying him for the office of shepherd. And then the first bit, I think, that he might be trained for trials and hardships and perils is how to lead them through this rough and dangerous desert, because the dangers are similar to the perils if you pick those words up: hardships and dangers, perils. So as he goes through these dangers and perils with the sheep, he's going to learn how to lead them through this rough and dangerous desert. So you see she's kind of expounding on the sentence before and showing how this is how it's going to come about. As he faces trials with the sheep, a bear comes and attack, or a lion, or that the way he's going to deal with those hardships and trials is going to prepare him to lead them through this rough and dangerous desert. And it's also going to qualify him as he looks after those individual sheep to know how to help, how to sympathise with their suffering.
And also,
So sorry, say that again?
that's how we be the labourer. We can be working, like co-labouring with
Yes, so as he does that, God's going to be with him, teaching him. Because it says the first sentence we read said the Lord was preparing him for this position. The Lord's with him to be a labourer with God. So God's doing that work with him in the wilderness. And then in the last part of that sentence, she does a compare and contrast. And what does she say that the flock is? Anybody?
Church.
The church, exactly. So now she brings in this parable that he might be qualified for the office of a shepherd of his own flock for a church whose God was the Lord. So this experience with the sheep is going to prepare him to lead God's church. So these Israelites that are being led out of Egypt are God's church, and he's separating them apart from the Egyptians. So in order to qualify him to lead God's church, he has to go through this experience of being a shepherd. So Moses has to leave the position of a king, apis bull, strong warrior, and step down and become a shepherd. Now, if we read 1SP 153.1, if Brother Aaron wants to post that up, yeah. We see here, this is the story of Joseph, which is future on, but I just want to pull out a point from this. It says, Joseph counselled his brethren when Pharaoh should ask them of their occupation to tell him frankly that they were shepherds, although such an occupation was regarded by the Egyptians as degrading. So when Joseph goes down into Egypt with his brothers, they're all shepherds, and he warns them to tell Pharaoh frankly, so that he knows up front, these guys are shepherds. And I won't go into all that, but the fact is that the Egyptians regarded shepherds as a degrading occupation, to the point where they didn't want to associate with shepherds. They would not eat with a shepherd, they would not live with a shepherd. I don't know where that comes from, but they've got this very negative view of shepherds. So now I want us to think about this concept in terms of Moses. Moses is at the top position in his country, and he's now asked by God to step down to the lowest of the low. In his mind, how did he picture the work of a shepherd? If he's been raised in an Egyptian court of Pharaoh, and they all think it's the lowest of the low to be a shepherd, it's the worst job you could have. It's like at the time of Christ being a tax collector, or I don't know what the equivalent would be in our day, but in any society with the worst job to have that people look down upon and say, well, what kind of people are these that do that kind of work? Is that kind of job? So in the eyes of the Egyptian, he steps down from the highest position to the lowest of the low. Such an occupation was degrading. So what did Moses have to go through to fit him to fulfill his mission, to fulfill this call, come out of her, my people, to lead this people to the promised land? What did he have to go through? This word degrading means causing a loss of self-respect, humiliating, shameful, causing people to feel they have no value. So we do not see how God sees. Do we see how the Egyptians see? Are we Egyptians? There's a social caste system here. There's a law that says you don't mix with these people. You look down on these people. They're not worth anything. They don't have any value. And I think if we look at our experience as conservative Adventist Christians, that's the same attitude we have to certain classes of people. We've accepted a view of the world which is warped, how we value a soul. And this is really what Moses has to learn. He does not value the souls of his people in the way that God wants him to. He does not see every sheep as of value. He doesn't see the individual. He's a leader of armies. He's a leader of the group. I've just got to get this group out of here and do this job. And he doesn't have that care and concern for the individual. He doesn't sympathize with their individual sufferings. He doesn't see what they're feeling and feel what they're feeling. And he will do that as he has to look after these sheep. He has to enter into their experience. And he hasn't experienced it before. He's got all this intellectual knowledge. He knows the message. He knows the truth. But he hasn't had an experience. And until he has that experience, he's not qualified to lead them. And so when we look at that in terms of our position, I don't know who we're going to say these Egyptians are. Are we going to say they're the world? Are we going to say they're an apostate Jew? Are we going to say they're apostate Protestants? Because in this history, there's a church-state relationship. So they are the false church, and they are also the state. So they're the world. The Egyptians are the world on one level, but they're also a false religion. They're the religion that Moses has become a part of. This is what he's coming out of. This is like the Millerites coming out of Protestantism in the 1800s. This is like us now coming out of apostate Adventism, apostate Protestant, same thing. He has to now come out of that system that he's learned, that religion that he's learned, that view of God that he's learned, which has all been shaped by the apis bull figure, the whole false religion, and he has to now step down to the level of a shepherd to learn what he has to learn, which is the lowest of the low. He has to have an experience now that he had not had before. So now he has to have an experience of that's going to shape his character to fit him to do this work he's called to do. And this is frightening when we think about us who think that we have an experience with God. He thought he had an experience with God. He's walking with God. He's listening to God's voice. He's doing everything he thinks is right. He's going to deliver his people. And he makes a false move. He kills the Egyptian. And now everything is changed. He has to become a shepherd. And this is the most degrading and humiliating job that an Egyptian could be called to do. And he has to experience this now.
Yeah, but Eric, he was willing to do that though, wasn't he?
He was willing to do that, yes. And I'm not sure we could say he has a choice on one level, because he runs into the wilderness. He meets the daughters of Jethro in the wilderness, Midian. They're there at the well and he helps them get the water for the sheep. And he's just doing the work that lies nearest now because there's no other options. All his options are taken away. He hasn't really got any options on one level. But I'm not saying he refused to do it, so he enters into that work willingly because he's got no other. He's been brought to a place of no option really. But you could say he chose to do it. And I was thinking of this in terms of Christ. When we look at Christ, we see that he's the highest in heaven. He's the leader of the angels, the heavenly host. He's the Son of God. And he steps down and he becomes a sinful human being. And that experience that Moses goes through, I think, is akin to Christ. That he gets everything stripped away and he becomes nothing overnight. And this is the position of Christ in coming to this earth, to minister to sinful human beings. And the pain and the suffering of that Moses has to go through now for 40 years to unlearn everything he's learned. The difference obviously is Christ doesn't have to unlearn anything, but that experience is similar, of stepping from the highest to the lowest. And I think this is what we're going through right now. So we have an intellectual knowledge of our message. Obviously we've not got it all correct. Sunday law, we didn't have a correct concept of what the Sunday law was, but we knew we've got to stand at the end of the world faithful to God and call out Nethinims and Levites, or call out a group, come out of her my people. So we understand our job function like Moses, but we've just got the details wrong like Moses. And so we're in a very similar position. So now God has corrected the message. He's corrected Moses, saying this is not the way you're going to do it. You're going to do it in a different way, and I'm going to train you how to do it now. You have to have an experience of identifying with the lowest of the low. So now we are now learning how to have an experience with identifying with the offcasts of society where we live. And those groups are, females, women, because they've been oppressed and persecuted, LGBTQ people, the people that society looks on as of no value. And we're going to have to identify and experience what they've experienced to be prepared to go through, to be qualified to lead the people. The next passage we look at is Fundamentals of Christian Education 360.1. So I don't know if we need a time check here. So that's Fundamentals of Christian Education 360.1.
Yeah, just so you know, you have 12 minutes remaining.
Okay, so hopefully we should finish off Moses, and then we might have to do another part of this. So let's read this one. Somebody out there, Brother Curtis, would you mind reading that, please? If you're there.
Hi, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Which sentence am I reading?
Just read. I think we'll read the paragraph. Fundamentals. That's one that's just posted. FE 360.1.
Okay. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He received an education in the providence of God, but a large part of that education had been unlearned and accounted as foolishness. Its impression had to be blotted out by 40 years of experience in caring for the sheep and the tender lambs. If many who are connected with the work of the Lord could be isolated as was Moses, and could be compelled by circumstances to follow some humble vocation until their hearts became tender, they would make much more faithful shepherds than they do now in dealing with God's heritage. They would not be so prone to magnify their own abilities, or seek to demonstrate that the wisdom of an advanced education could take the place of sound knowledge of God. When Christ came to the world, the testimony was that the world by wisdom knew not God. yet that it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe.
Thank you. So here she expounds more on this subject, and she starts out by saying Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So if we say that the Egyptians are a symbol of an apostate religion, then we could say, how could we change that sentence? But okay, so how would we change that sentence and apply it to us?
With the top one,
Yeah.
that we know all the wisdom of the apostate world,
Apostate.
Protestant world, I guess.
Yeah, I think.
So when it talks of the wisdom of the Egyptians, is it of their religion or of the like scientific realm, if you call it that, the secular wisdom?
How would you have read that before?
I would have read it as secular wisdom.
So he's qualified as an army captain. He's qualified in
Yeah.
all the science of Egypt, like science in Babylon.
Yeah.
And so would I, but I'm just wondering if we can read it in a slightly different way, in the sense that he had been when we see the connection with Apis Bull and his view of leadership, his view of how he's going to deliver the Israelites, he's been affected by, I think he's been affected by the religion of Egypt. But we read Ellen White, and she says, he refused to participate in the religious ceremonies of Egypt. So we think, okay, he's done the right thing outwardly, but has he been damaged inwardly by the religion of Egypt?
I'm just reading the next sentences again. So I think it encompasses all of it. So he received the wisdom of the secular industry, how to do things, different trades, like what today we would call, going to university to study physics or whatever. He received that, but as well as their idolatrous practices, because the next sentence she mentions how a large part of that education had to be unlearned and accounted as foolishness, which implies that there's a part that was useful for him. So the part that was accounted as foolishness, I would attribute to all the idolatrous taint that accompanied his learning.
Okay, so you're going to say the part that he had to unlearn was the religious part.
Yeah.
So if we put that in there, then couldn't we say the first sentence, Moses was learned, so we are learned in all the wisdom of what?
Everything that the world teaches. So we know the good and the bad, if you want to call it that. We have taken as the education from the world, which is good, formal education, but as well the bad things, because that word all encompasses everything that there is to learn in the world we live in. So,
okay, so
as
you're
well
going to
as the apostate Protestant mindset.
As well as the apostate. So with that, you don't want to say Seventh-day Adventism. You want to say the world and Seventh-day Adventism there, which is fair enough.
Sorry, pardon?
You don't want to say Seventh-day Adventism there. You don't want to say apostate Protestant Seventh-day Adventist church. It was learned in all the wisdom of the apostate Protestant conservative Seventh-day Adventist. You want to say it's the world plus what we've learnt religious. So as Seventh-day Adventism.
Yeah.
And then
which
you could say.
I don't think I'm going to class it as make that Egyptians the Seventh-day Adventists. I think that's us, and then we've taken that from the world as Seventh-day Adventists.
Okay. Cedra, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I think it's the Bible. It's us as Adventists.
And that we're learned in the wisdom of the Bible.
Yeah. Well, according to what we know, how we read it.
Okay. So I think in the context of this, Brother Curtis is saying he thinks it's all of it, and I'm saying I want to make an application. But okay, so if we say it's all of it, if we say it is the Bible as well as things we've learnt in the world, we're learning in all the wisdom of Egyptians. But I want to say, who are these Egyptians in terms of us? Because if we just say it's the world, they didn't teach us anything about the Bible.
I've got a hand.
Okay, sorry, hand, yeah.
No, as in my hand is up, like physically.
Yeah, that's okay, go on.
Can't see it. I think if we're going to make an application, then it would be good to remember the structure of how an alpha history differs from an omega history.
Yeah.
And that God doesn't necessarily have a people in an alpha history. He doesn't have a church. So like William Miller wasn't, the Protestants in that Millerite history weren't God's denominated people, if that makes sense, as opposed to the Seventh-day Adventist Church being God's denominated people. So whereas today you can have two calls to the church, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church were his people, in an alpha history he's still forming that people, he's still creating that people. So everything outside of that would be the world. So Miller was called out of Protestantism, so for Moses that would be the equivalent. Protestantism we would make Egypt.
Okay.
But Egypt and Protestantism weren't God's people, if you want to call it that. They were still part of the world.
Okay, on that level they weren't, but I suppose on another level the Protestants were God's people in the world at that time, because that was the only people he had to call the Millerites out of. So I suppose, yeah, I don't want to get too technical, I guess, about, yeah, so I see your point, but I think the point I was trying to make was, what is he, let's go on to the next sentence, that make it much clearer. So he's learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians, which includes the fact that, but I think we've underestimated, I guess the point I'm making is, we would automatically say it was the science of the Egyptians, it's all there, it's the scientific training, it's his military training, and all that he's learned in Egypt. And he didn't really learn about the gods, because she says, he refused to participate in the worship services. And I'm saying, I don't think we should underestimate the fact that he's picked up the religion of Egypt as well.
Yeah, so I would include that as well.
Yeah.
Because even for Miller, he picked up the religion that he was called out of.
Exactly, yeah. So
and he still had some of that hanging on. So as much as he was a learned man in that Enlightenment era, he still had picked up, as you pointing out, the religion that was in that world society at the moment. So for Moses, he picked up the religion as well as the military training, etc., etc.
So his view of God has been shaped by that false religion.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess that's the point I'm making. So that I think we've underestimated that in the past, because the way we've read this would be just, he's educated in the world, and now he's going to be called out of it, and he has to unlearn all those worldly things that he's learned. So he received an education, the next sentence says, he received an education in the providence of God. So it was providence that he's placed in the Egyptian court, and he learns that education. But a large part of that education had to be unlearned and accounted as foolishness. So most, I would say, if it was a large part, I would say it was a greater part of what he learned has to be thrown out now. And we would recognise that when we become Christians, we give up all this worldliness, and that's why it all has to be thrown out. But when we look at the paragraph we previously read, what he hasn't learned and what he's not qualified in is all to do with the way he sees people, which is a reflection of the way he sees God. And so his view of God has been shaped and damaged by his Egyptian apispal concept. And I think we've underestimated that, because we think he didn't really get involved in that, so he was protected from false religion. But I don't think he was protected in the way that we think he was. And so when we look at that, we say that what had to be unlearned, what has to be unlearned now and accounted as foolishness, is not so much the military skills that he learned, not so much a lot of those skills of discernment or study or discipline, all those worldly, what we might say worldly things. It's more his concept of God and his concept of humanity. His whole viewpoint has been skewed by the Egyptians' false religion and their concept of God, because his concept of God is damaged. The concept of how he thinks God wants him to do this work as a military leader and not as a servant, because he doesn't see who God is. He doesn't see God as a compassionate Heavenly Father. He sees him as an apis bull God. And even though he has some relationship with God, it's imperfect. He's not a labourer with God in the way God wants him to be. He doesn't reflect God's character in the way he wants him to. And I'm saying that's the greater portion of what he has to unlearn is this false concept of God, is this false religion, which is foolishness now. The way he's behaving, the way he's interacting with his fellow human beings, it has to be unlearned because he's got an apis bull figure instead of a suffering servant concept of God. So that's when it says the next sentence, its impression had to be blotted out by 40 years of experience in caring for the sheep and the tender lambs. It's about learning how to care and be tender that he hasn't got in his Egyptian training. And I don't think before we would have said that's what he has to unlearn. We'd have said, I don't know what we'd have said, but I think we'd have gone more along the lines of how you were answering, which is more the worldly stuff has to be got rid of because he has to be converted as a Christian now. But what that looks like, we never quantified it before as he basically has to learn empathy. And we never saw that as important before. We never saw that's what we have to learn. We thought we have to be more diligent at keeping reforms. We have to be more diligent at doing, being conservative Christian. And that's preserving the knowledge of God in the world. We never saw the underlying concept that what he has to learn is compassion now and empathy. And that's why he's so damaged, because he hasn't learned those traits of character in Egypt. Even in a place where he was faithful to God, where he thought he was God's people, he was an Israelite by birth. He thinks he's a child of Abraham in that sense. I mean, just like we think we are Seventh-day Adventists, we've got the truth, we've got all the knowledge we need, we just have to go through this mark of the beast test. And I just have to deliver the people now. And the thing we've got to learn is this empathy and compassion. And our view of God has been distorted by our apostate Protestant upbringing, just like his was by his Egyptian upbringing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Amen.
And so, in conclusion, this section then, it says that the way we would be qualified better to be better faithful shepherds would be if we, like Moses, could be isolated, if many who were connected with the work of the Lord could be isolated as was Moses, and could be compelled by circumstances to follow some humble vocation until their hearts became tender, they would make much more faithful shepherds than they now do in dealing with God's heritage. So what would be a good way for God's people to be qualified?
So, interesting, because many read this and then decide to not pursue, those lofty ambitions. So, for example, someone wants to become an astrophysicist or whatever, will read this and think, no, let me just retire and go become a farmer, so I can get the character that Moses had. Or someone who has ambitions to be a mathematician, or, like those big jobs, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
But will read this and think, no, let me become a humble farmer or a humble cleric or something, and put down all those ambitions. So how are we reading this?
I was hoping you were going to answer that. It's like, so now how does this apply to us? Perhaps what we need to do then. So we see here, there's two things that she says when she does this compare and contrast with Moses now to our time, to her time. And she says, many who are connected with the work of the Lord would be benefited if they could be isolated like Moses and follow some humble vocation until their hearts became tender. So the problem he has is there's a lack of humility, because she puts in there humble vocation. So the point of it is that it's a humbling thing. There's a lack of humility in his character, and his heart is not tender. So to learn that in this circumstance, he has to be isolated and become a shepherd. And she says if we could go through those two experiences, we would be more faithful shepherds. I think the next part of the sentence would help to answer it. The next sentence, They would not be so prone to magnify their own abilities or seek to demonstrate that the wisdom of an advanced education could take the place of a sound knowledge of God. So what's their problem? What's the problem with the people she's addressing now, the ministers in her time, or the people in her time who should make faithful shepherds? She says, which is probably Moses' problem too, because she's kind of repeating, comparing and contrasting and repeating and enlarging, but What's their problem?
I think,
Sorry, can I?
and the lack of empathy.
Sorry, yeah, Ren, I'm out of time.
Yeah, just a time
Okay.
reminder. I wrote it down.
Okay, so if I just have 5 minutes, I'll wrap it up. Okay, so Sister Cedra, what are you saying?
Humility and the lack of empathy because of their high positions. They tend to esteem themselves better than the next person.
So they've got what's the tendency to put themselves above others, magnify themselves, their own abilities, and trust perhaps in their own abilities. And I think that's kind of what Moses was doing. He's a trained military leader, so he's going to trust in his military qualifications to deliver Israel, and seek to demonstrate the wisdom and advanced education to take place of a sound. Okay, so and they're seeking to demonstrate that they've got this education that qualifies them for the position, and it takes the place of a sound knowledge of God. So she's saying, in one level they think they're qualified, but they don't have this experience with God. They're not a co-labourer. If we put it in terms of Moses, they're not a co-labourer with God. They're not walking with God in the spirit of God. So they've got form and spirit problems. And this was Moses' problem. Perhaps he's not trusting in God enough to do the work. He's all about his ability and how he can do it. So there's this lack of humility, and he hasn't got this knowledge of God that's correct. When people trust in their education, they think they've got advanced wisdom. They tend to be superior to people. They don't have that tenderness of heart towards others. So then it says, when Christ came to the world, the testimony was, the world by wisdom knew not God. So the world's wisdom didn't know God, yet that it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. So he sends them a message through Christ, and Christ's lifestyle and Christ's actions, the way he behaves, is seen as foolishness by people because it's nothing. It's a humiliating work of ministering to others. And yet that preaching, that whole lifestyle that Christ lived, was pleasing to God, and it was foolishness to the world, but that's the way he chose to do it. So the principles behind that, so going back to Curtis's question, what does that look like for us? What do we have to go through to be qualified to do this work? And how we've interpreted that is, don't go out and get an education, don't have an advanced education because it'll trip you up. Don't take these high-powered jobs because you need a humble vocation, you need to be a shepherd or a farmer. But if you can use the principles that she's pulling out here, how do you apply it, Brother Curtis? Do you have any thoughts?
I think I would apply it as a warning that in those situations, I think what we're learning now is more so, like to know the experience of a person in Syria, it doesn't necessarily mean I should give up all that I have, go live in Syria to know what they're going through. But to be more prone to listen and empathize with someone's situation. So despite your lofty position, your education or whatever, not forgetting to have that empathy in your heart, to listen more to the experiences of other people and those that don't have the same platform that you have or position that you have. So yeah, I would read this as a reminder to remain empathetic to the situations of other people and not miss. Yeah.
I think so too, but I think as well I'm seeing that what we try to do with this paragraph is we've always looked at this in terms of secular, in terms of applying it in a secular manner. Like he's come out of the wisdom of Egypt, it's a secular training. So this means you've got to isolate yourself and not take secular training. And we've applied it all on a secular level, and I think if we apply it on a spiritual level, it makes more sense.
Okay,
so what they need to do is be isolated, as was Moses, from all these wrong spiritual concepts and compelled to follow a humble vocation when it comes to spiritual things. So we think we're educated, we're advanced education as a prophetic group. If we apply this to the group, we think we've got all this knowledge of prophecy, we know everything, we're fitted for the mark of the beast test, we're ready to do the work. And God says, actually, you don't understand what you're doing and how you're doing it in the complete wrong way. And to be better qualified, to be faithful shepherds, you need to be isolated. And I don't know if we can apply that literally, but I'm looking at the coronavirus going, this is isolation. It's like forced isolation. It's almost like Moses in the wilderness. And the way God is bringing about circumstances, compelling circumstances to take humble vocations. I think to teach us something, like you just said, about how to treat people on a spiritual level. And so I think we can apply this on a spiritual level, as opposed to saying, it doesn't matter what job you do, you can be a doctor and you can still apply these principles. So in this passage, the way we're applying it, he had to come from a military leader in Egypt down to a shepherd to teach him about compassion and equality, basically, and how to lead people, how to have sympathy and empathy. But that's not what she's saying for us, I don't think, or that's not how we should apply it in our time. I don't think it matters what job you do. I think we have to go through a spiritual experience now of understanding that we didn't understand anything how we thought we could. We're not better than anyone else on a Christian level, because we thought we as conservative Christians were better than everybody else. And that's where we've been. And now we have to come down off that high pedestal and come to the bottom and recognise that we're not even on the value of a Nethinim and a Levite. Now we priests who thought we were so superior in hiding because we're so damaged. And once we see that, we can apply this in a different way, I think. Then it's not about what job you do. It's about your whole motive and spiritual attitude towards people. And our advanced education now is learning empathy. And how he's choosing to do that is putting us in this forced isolation now. Under COVID, he's put the whole world in isolation so that we are come apart and we're forced to face that we're not qualified for the job and we need an experience now. And he's giving it to us. I think this is just beginning of the process of that experience of looking after the sheep. And there's still a long way to go. But he's opened our eyes to the fact that this is what he's doing with us. So, sorry we have to stop there. We're out of time. And we still have some other quotes to look at with Christ and how we view souls. So next time we'll pick that up, about how we can more effectively practice empathy. And at least we can see now, we're getting a taste that Christ has always been trying to teach this to his people from the beginning. And this is not a new concept. It's not a new idea. It's not totally alien to the whole Sunday Law test. It's how he needs to qualify his church to finish the work, is teach them empathy. And it's always been that way. It's been there and we haven't seen it, I think. So let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we do thank you for opening our eyes to these concepts. We thank you for showing us that your people through history have always had an issue with how they see you, how they do your work, and how they view their fellow human beings. We thank you that you're showing us from the life of Moses that even though he was the most qualified person in Egypt's eyes, that he still lacked when it came to doing your work, and that we recognise he was the meekest man that walked the earth, and yet in this situation he had to unlearn for 40 years what he had learned. We know that this is a process for us. We've only been doing it for maybe a year and a half, and we recognise that it's going to take time, and we pray that you would give us that patience, that understanding, that experience that we need to be qualified to do your work in leading people out of the world and into your church. Help us, Lord, to set up this kingdom in the way that you want it set up, to do it in your strength and not our own, and to be filled with your love as we go forth to minister to the needs of others. Please be with us for the rest of this Sabbath day and bless us now, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.